Judge Richard Holloway believed he had seen every kind of person walk into his courtroom, from seasoned attorneys in tailored suits to nervous defendants clutching wrinkled documents. But the quiet woman standing alone at the defense table that morning seemed to him like the easiest case of all, and he was already certain how the story would end before it had even begun. The late morning sunlight filtered through the tall courthouse windows, casting long pale rectangles across the polished wooden floor while the faint hum of whispered conversations drifted through the gallery. Reporters adjusted their notebooks, a clerk shuffled paperwork behind the bench, and the steady tick of the wall clock marked the slow, deliberate rhythm of the American justice system at work. Emily Carter stood quietly near the front of the room, wearing a modest gray cardigan and a pair of simple flats, the kind of outfit that would disappear unnoticed in a crowded grocery store aisle. Her brown hair pulled neatly behind her ears and a thin folder held carefully in both hands. And to nearly everyone watching, she looked less like someone ready to argue a legal point and more like someone who had wandered into the wrong building entirely. Across the courtroom, a few spectators exchanged glances while a young reporter leaned toward another and whispered that the case would probably be over in 5 minutes. Because when a person showed up without a lawyer in a courtroom like this, the outcome at the case file, then lifted his eyes toward her with a thin expression that suggested the matter was already wasting his valuable time. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried clearly across the room with the controlled authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Miss Carter," he began slowly, "I understand you have chosen to represent yourself today." And a quiet ripple of curiosity moved through the gallery because the tone in his voice hinted that the next moments might not be kind. Emily nodded once, her posture calm though her hands tightened slightly around the folder, and she answered with a soft but steady yes. "Your Honor." The judge leaned forward, folding his hands together on the bench as though preparing to deliver a lecture rather than hear an argument, and the corners of his mouth curved just enough to signal that he had already formed his opinion. "You should understand, Miss Carter," he continued, "that the law is not something one simply guesses at, and representing yourself without training often leads to unfortunate misunderstandings." A few quiet chuckles drifted from somewhere near the back of the gallery, quickly stifled but not unnoticed. Emily remained silent. The judge flipped a page in the file, then looked up again, this time with open impatience, and the words that followed fell into the room with the weight of public judgment. "Frankly, Miss Carter, the argument you submitted here shows a remarkable level of ignorance about basic legal procedure." The sentence lingered in the air for a moment as several spectators shifted in their seats, and someone quietly exhaled through their nose in amusement, because courtroom humiliation had a way of drawing attention even from those who had arrived only out of curiosity. But Emily Carter did not react the way Judge Holloway expected. She did not protest. She did not lower her eyes in embarrassment, and she did not attempt to interrupt. Instead, she simply opened her folder, turned one page carefully, and looked up at the bench with an expression so calm that for the briefest moment the judge hesitated, unaware that the quiet woman he had just dismissed might be the only person in the entire courtroom who fully understood what was about to happen next. For several long seconds after the judge finished speaking, the courtroom remained suspended in an uneasy silence, the kind of silence that arrives when people expect embarrassment to follow. Yet Emily Carter did not shrink back from the bench or glance toward the gallery, where a few quiet smirks still lingered. Instead, she carefully slid one sheet of paper from the folder in her hands and placed it on the defense table as though she had rehearsed the motion many times before. Judge Holloway noticed the movement and leaned back slightly in his chair, clearly convinced that whatever she intended to say next would only confirm the opinion he had already voiced. The courtroom clock ticked loudly on the far wall, while a shaft of sunlight crept slowly across the polished wooden floor, and somewhere near the back a reporter adjusted the strap of his bag and prepared to write what he assumed would be a short and unremarkable story about an amateur attempting to argue law in front of a seasoned judge. Emily lifted her eyes toward the bench and spoke in a voice that was calm enough to surprise the clerk seated nearby. "Your Honor, I understand your concern about legal procedure, and I appreciate the opportunity to clarify something about the argument I submitted." Judge Holloway gave a brief dismissive nod, signaling that she could continue. though the expression on his face suggested he expected very little from whatever explanation might follow. Emily opened the folder again and turned another page, revealing several neatly printed documents that had been highlighted with careful attention, the kind of preparation that did not match the casual assumptions many people in the room had already made about her. She placed the documents side by side on the table, aligning the edges as though organizing evidence in a quiet classroom rather than defending herself in a formal courtroom. I believe the court may have overlooked a procedural detail connected to the filing of this complaint, she continued, still speaking gently but with growing clarity, and that detail directly relates to the ruling in Whitaker v. State decided in 1998. The moment those words left her mouth, something subtle shifted in the atmosphere of the courtroom. One of the attorneys seated along the side bench lifted his head, and the reporter who had expected an easy story paused with his pen hovering above the page. Judge Holloway's expression did not change immediately, but his eyes narrowed slightly as he studied the document Emily had just referenced. She did not rush her explanation, and she did not raise her voice. Instead, she spoke slowly, guiding the room through the reasoning as if she were leading a careful lesson. In that case, the appellate court ruled that a filing error identical to the one present here invalidated the entire procedural sequence that followed, which means the complaint submitted against me cannot legally proceed under the statutes cited in this case. The clerk glanced at the judge, uncertain whether to interrupt or simply record the statement as it unfolded. Emily continued turning pages in the folder, revealing additional documents marked with small handwritten notes that suggested hours of quiet study rather than guesswork. Outside the tall courthouse windows, a distant siren echoed briefly through the city streets before fading away, and inside the room, every small sound seemed louder than before. Judge Holloway leaned forward again and reached for the case file. Resting on his bench, flipping through the pages with more attention than he had shown earlier. No one in the gallery laughed now. The spectators who had arrived expecting a brief moment of humiliation were beginning to sense that the quiet woman standing alone at the defense table might have brought more preparation with her than anyone had anticipated, and for the first time that morning the judge did not immediately speak. Judge Holloway did not immediately respond to Emily Carter's statement, and that hesitation alone was enough to ripple quietly through the courtroom. Moments earlier, the room had expected an awkward explanation from someone clearly out of her depth. Yet now the judge himself seemed to be rereading the case file with an attention that had not existed when the hearing began. The faint turning of paper echoed across the silent gallery as he scanned several lines again, his finger tracing the paragraph Emily had just referenced. Across the room, the court clerk shifted slightly in his chair and glanced toward the bench, uncertain whether the judge would dismiss the argument or examine it further. Emily remained standing calmly beside the defense table, her posture straight, her expression steady, and the quiet confidence in her presence now felt different than it had only minutes earlier. Judge Holloway finally looked up again, though this time the impatience that had colored his earlier remarks was no longer as certain. "Miss Carter," he said slowly, "the court is familiar with Whitaker v. State. But that ruling involved a very specific procedural error," and he paused briefly as though weighing the next words carefully. Emily nodded respectfully and placed another document on the table in front of her. "Yes, Your Honor, and the procedural sequence described in that ruling is identical to the filing sequence in this complaint." The words were delivered without arrogance, simply as a statement of fact, yet they landed with surprising weight. One of the attorneys seated along the wall leaned forward slightly, clearly intrigued by the direction the exchange was taking. The reporter near the back began writing again, though this time his expression carried more curiosity than amusement. Emily continued speaking, her voice still measured and composed. "According to the court record, the complaint against me was filed at 3:27 in the afternoon on May 15th, but the supporting affidavit required by statute was not submitted until the following morning at 9:10, which means the complaint was accepted before the necessary documentation existed." Judge Holloway glanced again at the page in front of him and then toward the clerk. The clerk immediately began scanning the digital record displayed on the monitor beside him, his fingers moving quickly across the keyboard. A few seconds later, he cleared his throat softly. "Your Honor, the timestamps appear to match what Miss Carter just described." Benched to the calm woman standing alone before him. And throughout the courtroom, people who had once expected a brief moment of embarrassment now watched with growing realization that the quiet defendant had just introduced a legal argument the court could not easily ignore. The quiet tension that settled over the courtroom after Emily Carter finished speaking felt different from the silence that had come earlier, because this time it was not anticipation of embarrassment, but the growing awareness that something unexpected was unfolding in front of everyone present. Judge Richard Holloway lowered his gaze back to the case file, turning another page slowly while the faint rustle of paper seemed unusually loud in the still room. And for a long moment, he said nothing at all. The clerk watched the judge carefully while the attorneys along the side benches exchanged subtle glances that suggested professional curiosity rather than the quiet amusement that had existed earlier. Emily remained standing beside the defense table with her folder open, her hands resting lightly on the wood surface as if she were simply waiting for the next question rather than defending herself in a formal courtroom proceeding. Outside the tall courthouse windows, the distant sounds of city traffic drifted faintly through the thick glass. Yet inside the room, every breath and small movement seemed magnified by the silence. Judge Holloway finally leaned back in his chair and folded his hands together again, though the posture now carried less certainty than before. "Miss Carter," he said carefully, "you have presented an interpretation of procedural precedent that the court will consider, but you should understand that isolated case references do not always control a present matter." The tone of his voice was measured. The earlier edge of dismissal softened into something closer to caution. Emily nodded respectfully, as if acknowledging a familiar point. "That is correct, Your Honor," she replied, "which is why I also reviewed the county filing guidelines that govern the acceptance of complaints in this jurisdiction." Several heads in the gallery lifted slightly at those words, and even the reporter near the back paused his writing again. Emily gently turned another page in her folder and placed a printed document where it could be clearly seen. According to the County Administrative Handbook, Section 12.4, a complaint cannot be formally entered into the system unless the supporting affidavit has already been verified and attached. She spoke slowly and clearly, the way a teacher might guide students through a careful explanation. The clerk instinctively leaned closer to his monitor as though checking the document in the digital archive, while the judge's expression grew more thoughtful. Judge Holloway reached for a pair of reading glasses resting near the bench and briefly adjusted them before studying the page Emily had referenced. The courtroom remained silent long enough for the quiet hum of the overhead lights to become noticeable. When the judge looked up again, there was a new seriousness in his eyes. "Miss Carter," he said, "where did you obtain this handbook?" Emily answered without hesitation. "It is publicly available through the County Records Office website, Your Honor." The answer carried no hint of defiance, only simple clarity. Across the room, one of the attorneys shifted forward in his seat, as though recognizing the implications of what had just been said. The judge glanced once more at the file, and then toward the clerk, who nodded slightly after scanning another line of the record. Several people in the gallery now leaned forward with open interest rather than casual curiosity, sensing that the hearing had quietly transformed into something far more significant than anyone expected when the morning began. Judge Holloway rested his hand on the bench and studied Emily Carter for several seconds before speaking again, and although he did not yet admit it openly, the confident authority that had filled the courtroom earlier had begun to give way to a growing realization that the quiet woman standing alone before him might have uncovered a procedural flaw the court could not easily dismiss. The quiet weight of the moment settled deeper into the courtroom as Judge Richard Holloway continued studying the documents spread across the bench, and for the first time since the hearing began, his earlier certainty had been replaced by a careful, deliberate focus that everyone in the room could feel. The judge adjusted his glasses once more and turned another page in the case file, his finger tracing the line where the filing timestamp appeared, and although he did not immediately speak, the subtle tightening of his expression suggested that Emily Carter's explanation had reached a point the court could not casually ignore. Across the room, the clerk kept his eyes fixed on the digital record, confirming each detail that Emily had calmly referenced, while the attorneys seated along the side benches watched with quiet interest, their earlier skepticism now replaced by the cautious attention professionals reserved for a legal argument that might actually change the direction of a case. Emily remained exactly where she had been standing since the beginning of the hearing, her folder open on the table and her posture relaxed but attentive, as though she understood that the strength of her argument did not depend on dramatic gestures, but on the simple clarity of the law itself. The reporter in the back row leaned forward again, writing quickly now as the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted from curiosity to something much more serious. Judge Holloway finally placed the case file flat on the bench and looked toward the clerk. "Mr. Brooks," he said slowly, "please confirm the submission timeline for the affidavit attached to this complaint." The clerk nodded and began navigating the electronic filing system. On the monitor beside him, the faint clicking of keys echoing through the room, while several people in the gallery leaned slightly forward in their seats. After a brief moment, the clerk cleared his throat and spoke carefully. "Your Honor, the affidavit was verified at 9:10 in the morning on May 16th, which is approximately 17 hours after the complaint itself was entered into the system." A quiet murmur rippled across the gallery before fading again into silence. Judge Holloway rested his hand on the bench and considered the information for several seconds before turning his attention back to Emily Carter. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice noticeably more measured now, "you appear to have conducted an unusually thorough review of these filings." Emily offered a respectful nod. "I wanted to be certain I understood the record correctly before coming to court today, Your Honor." The answer carried no pride or defensiveness, only a simple statement of preparation. The judge leaned back slightly in his chair and glanced once more at the highlighted section of the administrative handbook Emily had placed before him. The quiet hum of the courtroom lights filled the silence that followed. Along the wall, one of the attorneys exchanged a glance with a colleague, as though silently acknowledging the strength of the point that had just been made. Judge Holloway finally spoke again, though this time the tone that filled the courtroom was far different from the one that had greeted Emily when the hearing began. "If the affidavit was not verified until the following morning," he said slowly, "then the complaint should not have been accepted into the system at the time it was filed." The words lingered in the air for several seconds as the realization spread through the room. Emily did not interrupt or attempt to press the moment further. She simply stood quietly beside the defense table while the judge reviewed the documents again, and throughout the courtroom, the spectators who had arrived expecting a brief display of courtroom authority now watched with growing awareness that the quiet woman once dismissed as ignorant had just uncovered a procedural flaw that the court itself was now forced to confront. For several long seconds after the judge spoke, no one in the courtroom moved. The realization hung in the air like a quiet shift in gravity, subtle but unmistakable. Judge Richard Holloway remained seated behind the bench, his fingers resting on the edge of the open case file, as though he were weighing every page against the responsibility of his position. The early confidence that had filled his voice at the start of the hearing had gradually faded, replaced by the careful deliberation expected from someone who understood the seriousness of the law he represented. Emily Carter stood calmly beside the defense table with her folder still open, her expression steady and patient, not triumphant and not anxious, simply attentive to whatever the court would decide next. Along the side benches, the attorneys who had once watched with mild curiosity were now fully engaged, their eyes moving between the judge, the clerk, and the documents that had quietly reshaped the direction of the hearing. Judge Holloway finally cleared his throat and turned toward the clerk once again. "Mr. Brooks," he said, "please confirm for the record whether the filing system allows a complaint to be entered without a verified affidavit attached." The clerk glanced down at the administrative handbook displayed on the monitor beside him and began scrolling through the relevant section, his brow tightening slightly as he located the language Emily had referenced earlier. After a moment, he nodded slowly. "Your Honor, according to Section 12.4 of the County Administrative Filing Guidelines, the complaint must include a verified affidavit before it is accepted into the system. The rule does not allow the complaint to be entered first." The quiet statement echoed across the courtroom with more impact than anyone expected. A low breath moved through the gallery as the spectators processed the significance of the confirmation. Judge Holloway removed his glasses for a moment and set them gently on the bench while considering the information before him. The courtroom clock ticked softly on the wall, each second stretching the silence further. Finally, the judge looked toward the prosecution table. where the county attorney sat reviewing the file with a visibly concerned expression. "Counsel," the judge said, "can you explain why the complaint was entered before the affidavit was verified?" The attorney hesitated briefly before standing. "Your Honor, it appears the filing sequence may have occurred due to an administrative oversight." The explanation sounded careful but uncertain, and even those unfamiliar with legal procedure could sense that the response did little to resolve the issue. Judge Holloway nodded slowly and then turned his attention back to Emily Carter. "Miss Carter," he said with a noticeably different tone than before, "you have argued that this filing sequence invalidates the complaint under established precedent." Emily responded respectfully, "Yes, Your Honor, because the complaint was accepted without the required affidavit. The filing does not meet the statutory requirements described in both the Whitaker decision and the county administrative guidelines." The judge listened without interruption, his expression thoughtful as he returned his gaze to the documents on the bench. The gallery remained silent, the earlier tension replaced by a quiet recognition that the balance of the hearing had shifted entirely. Emily did not move or attempt to emphasize her point further. She simply waited while the judge reviewed the file again. And throughout the room it became clear that the moment, which had begun with dismissal and quiet laughter, had evolved into something far more serious, because the court now faced a procedural reality that could not easily be set aside. The silence in the courtroom had grown so complete that even the faint ticking of the wall clock sounded unusually loud, and Judge Richard Holloway remained still behind the bench for several moments, as though carefully measuring every word he would say next. The documents spread across the polished surface before him were no longer being skimmed quickly, but studied with deliberate attention. The kind of attention that came when a judge understood that a ruling now carried consequences beyond simple courtroom routine. Emily Carter stood quietly at the defense table, her hands resting lightly beside the folder that had guided her calm explanation through the legal maze that moments earlier had seemed impossible for someone in her position to navigate. Along the side benches, the attorneys who had once watched the hearing with mild curiosity now leaned forward openly, their expressions thoughtful as they followed each development with the quiet focus of professionals who recognized a turning point when they saw one. The county attorney shifted uncomfortably at the prosecution table while flipping through the complaint documents again, as though hoping another detail might appear that would repair the procedural flaw now sitting plainly in the record. Judge Holloway finally lifted his gaze from the file and addressed the room in a steady voice that carried the weight of judicial responsibility rather than the dismissive tone that had greeted Emily earlier that morning. "The court must determine whether the complaint before us meets the statutory requirements necessary for it to proceed," he said slowly, and the clarity of his words caused several spectators in the gallery to straighten in their seats. He turned briefly toward the clerk. "Mr. Brooks, please confirm once more for the record that the affidavit verifying the complaint was submitted after the complaint itself had already been accepted into the filing system." The clerk checked the monitor again and nodded carefully. "Yes, Your Honor. The record shows that the affidavit was verified the following morning." The judge folded his hands together thoughtfully, then looked toward the county attorney. "Counsel, do you have any legal authority that would allow the court to overlook this sequence and proceed with the complaint despite the absence of a verified affidavit at the time of filing?" The attorney hesitated, scanning the papers in front of him while the entire courtroom waited. After several seconds, he spoke carefully. "Your Honor, I cannot locate a precedent that directly contradicts the rule described in the Whitaker decision." The admission settled over the room like a quiet confirmation. Judge Holloway nodded once and turned his attention back toward Emily Carter. "Miss Carter," he said, "earlier this morning I questioned your understanding of legal procedure." And for a moment the judge paused as if recognizing the significance of what he was about to acknowledge in front of everyone present. "You have presented a detailed interpretation of both precedent and county administrative rules, and the court has now confirmed the accuracy of the filing sequence you described." Emily did not react with satisfaction or pride. She simply inclined her head respectfully. The judge continued speaking, his voice steady and deliberate. "The law requires that procedural safeguards exist not only for the court, but also for the individuals who stand before it. And when those safeguards are not followed, the court must take that failure seriously." The courtroom remained silent, as every person present understood that the direction of the hearing had fully changed. The woman who had entered the room alone with a simple folder and no legal representation was no longer the subject of quiet laughter, but the person whose careful reasoning had brought the court itself to reconsider the case before it. The courtroom remained wrapped in a deep and thoughtful silence after Judge Richard Holloway finished speaking, the kind of silence that carried respect rather than tension, and for a moment it seemed as though the entire room was quietly acknowledging how dramatically the course of the hearing had changed. The judge leaned back slightly in his chair and closed the case file in front of him with deliberate care, the soft sound of the cover meeting the polished wood of the bench echoing faintly. Across the chamber, Emily Carter still stood beside the defense table exactly where she had been since the beginning of the hearing, her gray cardigan and modest appearance unchanged. Yet the way people looked at her now was entirely different from the way they had looked at her earlier that morning. The spectators in the gallery who had once exchanged amused glances now watched with quiet respect, while the reporter in the back row continued writing quickly, clearly aware that the story unfolding in front of him was far more significant than the brief courtroom moment he had expected when he first arrived. Judge Holloway removed his glasses once more and rested them gently on the bench before speaking again, his voice steady and clear. The court has reviewed the filing record, the administrative guidelines, and the precedent cited during this hearing, and the conclusion before us is straightforward. The judge paused briefly, allowing the words to settle into the quiet room. Under the established rules governing this court, a complaint that is entered without a verified affidavit does not meet the procedural requirements necessary for the case to proceed. The county attorney lowered his gaze toward the papers on his table, saying nothing. Emily remained silent, her posture respectful as she waited for the judge to finish. Judge Holloway continued speaking, his tone now carrying the balanced authority expected from someone entrusted with the responsibility of the law. Procedural safeguards exist to ensure fairness for every individual who stands before this court, and when those safeguards are not followed, the court must address that failure regardless of the circumstances. He opened the file again briefly, glancing once more at the timestamps that had started the entire chain of events. The complaint in this matter was accepted before the required affidavit was verified, which means the filing sequence did not comply with the administrative rules governing this jurisdiction. A quiet murmur moved through the gallery before fading again into attentive silence. The judge finally lifted the small wooden gavel resting beside the file and held it lightly above the bench. Therefore, the court finds that the complaint cannot proceed in its current form. The simple statement carried unmistakable finality. With a single controlled motion, he lowered the gavel, the sharp sound echoing briefly across the courtroom walls. The case before this court is dismissed due to improper filing procedure. The room remained silent for a moment after the ruling, as though the significance of what had just occurred needed time to settle. Judge Holloway looked toward Emily Carter once more, his expression calm but thoughtful. "Miss Carter," he said, "your attention to the details of the law has been noted by this court." Emily offered a quiet nod in response, gathering the documents in her folder with the same calm care she had shown since the beginning of the hearing. Around the room, people continued watching as she closed the folder and prepared to leave the defense table, the quiet realization spreading through the courtroom that the woman who had entered alone and been dismissed as ignorant had just guided the court itself to a ruling that no one in the room would soon forget. For a few moments after the gavel struck the bench, the courtroom remained completely still, as though the room itself needed time to absorb what had just happened. Emily Carter quietly gathered the last of the papers from the defense table and slid them neatly back into her folder, the same careful motion she had used throughout the hearing. And as she closed the folder, a faint creak of wooden benches echoed behind her, where several spectators shifted in their seats. Judge Richard Holloway remained seated behind the bench, his expression thoughtful as he watched the quiet woman who had just walked through the courthouse doors earlier that morning with nothing more than a simple folder and a calm understanding of the law. The county attorney slowly organized his own papers without speaking, while the court clerk entered the dismissal into the official record. The reporter in the back row continued writing quickly, pausing once to glance up at Emily with a look that now carried respect rather than curiosity. Emily stepped away from the defense table and began walking toward the aisle that led to the courtroom doors. the soft sound of her shoes against the polished wooden floor carrying through the silent chamber. No one laughed now, and no one whispered, because the mood of the room had shifted entirely from the casual expectations of earlier that morning to something much quieter and more reflective. Just as Emily reached the aisle, Judge Holloway spoke again, his voice calm, but carrying clearly through the courtroom. "Miss Carter." She paused and turned slightly toward the bench. The judge rested his hands together before continuing. "Earlier today, I spoke with unnecessary certainty about your understanding of the law." The admission was brief but sincere, and the people in the gallery listened closely as the judge continued. "The court depends on preparation, clarity, and respect for procedure, and it is evident that you approached this hearing with all three." Emily offered a small respectful nod. "Thank you, Your Honor." Her voice remained steady and polite, free of triumph or resentment. Judge Holloway inclined his head slightly in return, acknowledging the moment with the quiet professionalism expected in his courtroom. "You may go, Miss Carter." Emily turned again and continued walking toward the doors while the courtroom watched her leave. Outside the tall windows, the afternoon sunlight had shifted, casting long golden lines across the floor as she passed through the doorway and into the courthouse hallway beyond. Inside the courtroom, the silence lingered for several seconds after she disappeared from view. And finally, the judge closed the case file one last time and prepared to call the next matter on the docket. Yet even as the normal rhythm of the courtroom resumed, there remained an unspoken understanding among those who had witnessed the hearing. A woman who had entered the room quietly and been dismissed with a single word had left behind a powerful reminder that dignity does not need to announce itself loudly, and that the law, when carefully understood, can speak with a clarity that no assumption can silence.